The silence above the clouds. The sky was calm when Flight 730 lifted off from Los Angeles. Passengers settled into their seats, expecting nothing more than a peaceful journey to Tokyo. Among them sat Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, quietly taking their seats near the middle of the plane, unnoticed by most. Both were traveling for a charity event, hoping for rest between long weeks of filming and humanitarian work. They smiled politely at each other, unaware that this flight would soon test the very limits of their courage. Outside, the sunlight shimmered across endless clouds. The captain's voice came through, calm and confident, promising smooth skies and warm meals. People relaxed. A young mother rocked her baby. An elderly couple held hands, and two students whispered excitedly about meeting their hero, Keanu, though they were too shy to approach him. Keanu glanced out the window, lost in thought. He noticed how peaceful the clouds looked, almost unreal, like a sea made of light. Sandra was reading quietly beside him, her fingers trembling slightly. When he asked if she was nervous, she smiled and said she had always been afraid of flying, but trusted the people who built machines meant to reach the sky. Her voice carried a strange softness, one that made even the hum of engines sound distant. For the first 2 hours, everything was perfect. Flight attendants served meals, laughter filled the aisles, and a calm rhythm settled over the cabin. Keanu watched a little girl draw pictures of airplanes and whispered to Sandra, saying how pure a child's hope could be when untouched by fear. Sandra nodded, her eyes softening. But then, without warning, the world shifted. The first jolt came like a sharp whisper under the floor. A tremor ran through the seats, followed by a faint metallic sound. A few passengers looked around confused. Keanu frowned and removed his headphones. Another jolt followed, stronger this time, making drinks spill and trays rattle. Sandra gripped her armrest, her knuckles pale. The cabin lights flickered once, then twice. The steady hum of the engines faltered, stuttered, and finally broke into silence. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. Only the sound of the wind pressing against the windows remained. It was the kind of silence that fills the air before panic begins. Then, a child cried. The captain's voice came through again, this time strained but controlled. He announced that one of the engines had lost power and that they were switching to emergency systems. His tone was calm, yet everyone could hear the fear hidden beneath it. The oxygen masks dropped from above like pale ghosts. People gasped. A flight attendant ran down the aisle, urging everyone to stay calm. Keanu stood, helping a frightened old man pull down his mask. Sandra reached for a young mother whose hands were shaking too much to help her baby. The plane trembled again. Through the window, Keanu saw one of the engines flickering with faint sparks. The sight made his stomach twist, but he forced himself to stay steady. He whispered to Sandra, "Breathe slow. Stay with me." She nodded, but her voice cracked when she asked, "What if we fall?" "Then we fight the fall," he said softly. The captain's next announcement made the cabin erupt in murmurs. They had lost power in both right engines. The plane was descending faster than expected, and communication with ground control was unstable. Sandra's heart pounded as she looked around. People clutched one another. A man prayed aloud. Another shouted for help. Keanu moved to assist the crew, helping calm those closest to him. The crew, though frightened, followed training, distributing instructions and checking rows. But the fear was growing heavier, spreading like cold smoke through every corner of the plane. Outside, clouds thickened into dark gray. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the wings like the edges of a torn photograph. Sandra's eyes met Keanu's. No words were needed. They both knew this was not a simple turbulence. Minutes stretched like hours. The cabin tilted slightly, and a collective gasp filled the air. Someone shouted that they were losing altitude too quickly. The captain's voice returned, trembling now. Admitting that they were working on manual control because automatic systems had failed, Keanu moved to the front, helping a flight attendant who had fallen while trying to secure the service cart. Sandra followed, helping to keep passengers calm. A teenage boy whispered that he could not breathe, and Sandra held his hand until he did. She kept whispering stories about courage and light, even as her own voice trembled. The captain called for assistance from anyone with aviation experience. No one responded at first. People were frozen in fear. Keanu looked at Sandra, then at the cockpit door and said quietly, "Maybe we can help somehow." She hesitated, whispering, "You're not serious?" He nodded. "I can follow instructions and maybe I can help them focus." Before she could stop him, he moved forward. The crew recognized him, startled, but he simply said, "It doesn't matter who I am, just tell me what you need." Inside the cockpit, chaos reigned. Alarms blared, screens flickered, and the co-pilot was trying to restart auxiliary systems. The captain's forehead glistened with sweat as he fought to stabilize the descent. Keanu stayed near the door, asking what he could do. The captain told him to keep the crew informed and prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Keanu returned and told Sandra what was happening. She took charge of the back rows, echoing instructions, keeping voices calm. Her calm tone made people listen, even as fear tightened their chests. Outside, rain began to fall, streaking across the windows like silver threads. Thunder rumbled above them. The plane trembled again. Then came the moment that changed everything. A bright flash lit up the right wing, followed by a deafening bang. People screamed as smoke filled the air. The oxygen mask swayed violently. Keanu rushed toward the window, his heart racing. The entire right wing was on fire. The captain's voice cracked as he shouted through the speakers that they had lost full control. Altitude warnings screamed across the cockpit. For a moment, everything blurred. The noise, the fear, the chaos. Sandra grabbed a child, covering her eyes. Keanu tried to help a flight attendant who had collapsed. The plane tilted further, and luggage fell from the overhead compartments. And then, something remarkable happened. In the middle of the panic, Keanu's calm voice rose above the noise. He shouted for everyone to listen. He told them to hold on, to stay low, to protect the children. Somehow, his voice carried strength. Even in fear, it gave people something to anchor to. He moved row to row, checking on people, steadying them. Sandra joined him, helping wherever she could. Despite the chaos, they worked together as if they had done this 1,000 times before. The fire on the wing grew brighter. The captain yelled that they needed to reduce weight to improve glide distance. Sandra helped others throw heavy items toward the back storage. Keanu moved toward the cargo door with a crew member to help balance the plane. Lightning struck nearby again, shaking everything. Sandra stumbled, falling against a seat. Keanu ran back, pulling her up just as another tremor hit. They clung to each other for balance, breathing hard. She whispered, "What if this is it?" He looked at her with quiet certainty and said, "Then let's make it mean something." His words seemed to freeze time. Even through the storm, there was stillness in her heart. Suddenly, the cockpit called for assistance. Both pilots were struggling with manual override, and the captain's arm was injured. The crew panicked, unsure how to respond. Keanu turned toward the cockpit without hesitation. Sandra called out, "Keanu, wait!" He turned back, his voice steady. "I'll be fine. Just keep them calm." And with that, he disappeared behind the cockpit door. The moment he entered, the door locked, sealing him away from the rest. Sandra stood frozen, staring at the closed door, listening to the sounds of wind, alarms, and the faint shouts of coordination. Minutes passed. The descent continued. People began to pray, whispering, sobbing quietly. Sandra closed her eyes, her hand trembling against her chest. She whispered his name once, then forced herself to move again. She helped a crying child, adjusted oxygen masks, and tried to ignore the growing sound of the engines dying completely. Then came another announcement, this one from Keanu's voice. He was speaking from the cockpit. His tone was calm, steady, and filled with quiet determination. He said they were losing altitude fast, but were trying something new. He asked everyone to fasten seatbelts, stay low, and trust the process. The plane dipped again. People screamed, holding on to their seats. Sandra gripped both armrests, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. Outside, the clouds broke open, revealing a massive stretch of ocean below. Lightning cracked across the horizon, painting everything in flashes of silver and white. Keanu's voice returned, softer now, saying, "We're going to try to glide. Hold on tight." And then, the plane tilted sharply to the left. A cry swept through the cabin as they descended toward the dark water below. The sound of the wind grew deafening, like 1,000 whispers screaming at once. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She reached for the nearest hand, a stranger's hand, and held it tight. The last thing she heard before everything went black was Keanu shouting, "We're not done yet!" The screen inside the cabin flickered once, then went dark. The plane vanished into the storm, and part one ends there, suspended between heaven and earth. Between faith and fear, with Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock fighting not only for survival, but for the souls of everyone on board. The heartbeat in the storm. The world was upside down when Sandra opened her eyes. A faint hum filled her ears, like the echo of thunder trapped inside a dream. She couldn't tell if they were still falling or floating. The lights flickered dimly, shadows moving across terrified faces. Somewhere ahead, a child whimpered. Somewhere behind, someone prayed in broken whispers. The cabin smelled of smoke and fear. The oxygen masks dangled loosely now, swinging like ghosts above trembling passengers. Sandra's head throbbed, her vision blurred, and when she tried to stand, the floor tilted sharply to one side. Outside the window, rain still lashed against the glass. But below the clouds, there was something new, light, faint, and trembling, like a reflection of hope dancing on the sea. Then came Keanu's voice again, distant but alive, breaking through the intercom like a fragile thread holding everything together. He said the impossible had happened. They had managed to restart one of the engines manually, though it was unstable. The plane was gliding, not flying, and every second mattered. His tone was calm, but Sandra could hear the exhaustion behind it. She imagined him in the cockpit, sweat streaking his forehead, hands gripping the controls with sheer willpower. The captain must have been guiding him through every move, yet even trained pilots feared what came next. A murmur swept through the cabin. Hope and fear tangled together. Some cried with relief. Others whispered that they would never make it. Sandra steadied herself, helping a woman whose child was struggling to breathe. She tore a piece of her own scarf and tied it around the child's mouth to filter the smoke. The mother wept, thanking her through trembling lips. Keanu's voice returned, giving coordinates, saying they were near an island formation shown faintly on radar. If they could maintain the glide, they might reach shallow waters near a small coast. But every minute they stayed in the air meant another chance for the engine to fail again. The storm outside grew darker, waves rising like walls of moving glass. Lightning flashed, showing the ocean below, angry and alive. Sandra's stomach twisted at the sight. She turned to see a young man staring out the window, frozen. She placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't look at the sea, look at me. We're still here. That means we still have a chance." Those words became her anchor, though deep inside she was trembling. In the cockpit, Keanu's heart pounded against his ribs. The captain's left arm was bandaged, his right hand shaking as he pointed at the readings. The co-pilot was managing communication, though signals were weak. Lightning interference made ground control useless. It was just them, 3 humans against the storm. Keanu focused on the controls, feeling resistance in the column, hearing the dull groan of metal under stress. He had learned enough from simulators during his film training years ago to understand the basics of balance and pitch. But this was no movie. There were no retakes. Every small error could mean the end. The captain muttered instructions. Keanu adjusted the flaps, listening, counting, breathing through each second. Sweat rolled down his temple. Outside, the right wing glowed faintly red from the fading fire, sparks dying into steam as rain hit the metal. "We have one chance," the captain said through clenched teeth. "We'll aim for that island." "We can't see it, but the radar says it's there." Keanu nodded, eyes fixed on the fading horizon. Back in the cabin, Sandra moved through the aisles again, ignoring the pain in her leg. She gathered passengers, organizing them to brace for impact. Her voice became steady, strong, like the captain of another ship trying to keep her people from sinking. She spoke of light, courage, and gratitude. She told them to think of the people they loved, to hold that thought until it became stronger than fear. As she spoke, the crying softened. Even the storm's roar seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Then came another violent shake. The single engine sputtered, coughed, and then went silent again. The plane dropped sharply, sending bodies upward for a split second before gravity slammed them back down. Screams filled the air. Trays crashed, oxygen masks swung wildly. Sandra fell hard against a seat, gasping as pain shot through her ribs. In the cockpit, alarms screamed once more. The captain tried to restart the auxiliary system, but nothing responded. Keanu pressed his hand against the console, whispering to himself, "Come on, don't give up!" For a moment, there was nothing but chaos. And then, in that chaos, something miraculous appeared through the fog. A faint shadow below them, a strip of land half covered by mist. Keanu's eyes widened. "There," he said breathlessly. "There's the island," the captain nodded, voice hoarse. "Too steep. But we have to try." They lowered the flaps, aiming for the shallow curve near the beach. The plane trembled violently as wind pushed against it. The sound of metal grinding filled the cockpit. Keanu felt the control column fight back like a living thing refusing to obey. The captain shouted adjustments, and Keanu followed, his muscles screaming from the strain. Inside the cabin, Sandra shouted for everyone to brace. She grabbed a seat and pulled a child into her arms. The plane tilted further, the lights flickering out completely. For one terrifying second, everything went silent. The engines, the wind, even the storm. Then came the impact. The sound was beyond anything human ears could truly bear. A roar of twisting metal, shattering glass, and crashing waves exploded around them. Seats broke, luggage flew, water sprayed through cracks in the fuselage. People screamed, then were drowned out by the sound of the sea invading the cabin. Sandra's world turned black as freezing water slammed against her. She clung to the child, her lungs burning as the plane broke apart around them. She tried to remember which way was up, but darkness swallowed everything. Keanu felt the cockpit break loose, metal tearing beside him. The captain shouted something, then vanished into the chaos. Keanu's hand slipped from the controls as the nose of the plane plunged into the waves. Cold, endless water swallowed him whole. Silence. A heartbeat. Then, a faint sound. Gasping. Sandra's head broke through the surface. She coughed violently, clutching the child against her chest. The wreckage burned faintly behind them, pieces of the plane floating on the waves. Lightning still flashed above, showing fragments of hope amid destruction. "Keanu," she gasped, turning in every direction. "Keanu, where are you?" Her voice was swallowed by the wind. Then she saw movement, a hand gripping a floating panel near the broken wing. She swam toward it, ignoring the pain, calling his name again. When she reached him, he was half-conscious, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his lips pale but still breathing. She dragged him closer, holding on to the debris with one arm. Around them, other survivors clung to floating pieces, shivering in the cold rain. Some cried for loved ones, others simply stared at the sky in disbelief. Keanu opened his eyes slowly, coughing water. His voice was faint but steady. "Are you all right?" Sandra let out a broken laugh, half sobbing, half relieved. "You almost crashed a plane and you're asking me that?" He smiled weakly. "Almost doesn't count." The storm continued, but its strength was fading. Distant thunder rolled away into the horizon, leaving behind only waves and rain. They floated together, surrounded by survivors. In the far distance, the faint outline of the island shimmered under the clouds. Sandra looked toward it, whispering, "That's where we go. We don't stop now." Keanu nodded, his hand tightening around the wreckage. "We get everyone there." The survivors began to move slowly, pushing debris together to stay afloat. Teamwork replaced panic. Keanu helped a man with a broken arm, while Sandra comforted a crying teenager who had lost his shoes, but not his will to live. Each moment became a quiet battle for hope. When the rain finally eased, the first sign of dawn broke through the clouds. A pale golden light touched the waves, making everything shimmer. The sea still looked endless, but now there was color, warmth, and life. As the sun rose higher, they drifted closer to the island. Exhaustion pulled at their bodies, yet something deeper kept them going. Maybe it was faith, or maybe it was the simple human need to survive together. Sandra looked at Keanu, her voice trembling. "Do you think anyone knows we're alive?" He stared at the horizon and said quietly, "They will." A bird circled above, its wings wide against the morning light. It was the first living thing they had seen since the crash, and somehow It felt like a promise. But just as hope began to bloom, Sandra noticed something strange. One of the survivors, an old man clutching a life vest, was pointing toward the far end of the island. His voice cracked with disbelief as he said, "That's no empty shore. There's smoke rising there." Keanu turned sharply. In the distance, thin trails of dark smoke curled into the sky from behind the trees. Someone was already there. And as the survivors drifted closer, the waves carried them toward a new mystery, one that would test not just their strength, but the very essence of who they were. The plane had fallen, but the story had only just begun. The Island of Echoes. The sun rose like a reluctant promise over the endless horizon, spreading pale gold across a sea littered with fragments of wreckage. Sandra Bullock's arms trembled as she helped pull another survivor onto a piece of floating debris. The island lay only a few hundred meters away now, its dark green forest glimmering through a veil of mist. It looked peaceful from afar, but peace after disaster often hides the next storm. Keanu Reeves was barely conscious, his voice weak but steady as he guided others toward the shore. His hand was bleeding from torn metal, yet he refused to rest. Each stroke through the waves was a vow that no one would be left behind. By the time they reached the beach, their bodies were trembling from exhaustion. Sandra collapsed onto the warm sand, her breath sharp and uneven. Survivors fell beside her, coughing salt water and crying in disbelief. For a moment, no one spoke. The island was eerily quiet except for the distant crash of waves and the faint cry of seabirds circling above. Keanu dragged himself to the nearest tree, sitting in silence as the others gathered around. They were 22 survivors out of more than 100. Some were injured, others in shock, and all were waiting for the realization to catch up to them, that they were alive, stranded, and unseen by the world. Sandra stood slowly, brushing sand from her face. She walked to the edge of the trees, where smoke curled faintly through the leaves. "Someone's here," she whispered. Her words carried both hope and caution. Keanu joined her, his eyes narrowing. "Or something's burning." They exchanged a glance that held the weight of every disaster movie they had ever acted in. Except this time, there were no scripts, no cameras, and no guarantees of survival. They decided to move toward the smoke. Keanu took a piece of broken metal as a makeshift tool, while Sandra led a small group of survivors through the dense undergrowth. The island smelled of wet soil and salt. Vines twisted around trees, and unseen insects hummed in the shadows. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a forgotten world. After half an hour of walking, they reached a clearing. At its center stood a small wooden hut made from driftwood and rusted metal. Beside it, a dying fire crackled weakly. Keanu froze. There were footprints in the sand, fresh ones. "Someone's been here recently," he said quietly. Sandra looked around. "But where are they now?" A rustle came from behind the hut. Instinctively, Keanu raised his makeshift tool and stepped forward. Sandra followed, her heart pounding. When they turned the corner, they found a man, thin, tanned, and barefoot, holding a fishing spear. His beard was thick, his eyes alert yet haunted. He looked at them for a long moment before lowering the spear. His voice was rough and cracked. "You came from the sky." Keanu nodded slowly. "Our plane went down. We thought the island was empty." The man laughed softly, though it sounded more like a sigh. Empty is a word people use when they don't stay long enough. His name was Nathan. He said he had been stranded for over 3 years, the lone survivor of a cargo ship that vanished during a storm. He had built the hut himself, hunted fish, and collected rainwater. He had seen passing planes, but none close enough to notice his signals. He had stopped believing anyone would ever come. When he saw the smoke from the wreck, he thought it was a dream. Sandra listened, her heart aching. She looked at Keanu, who studied the man with quiet respect. "You survived alone for 3 years?" Keanu asked. Nathan smiled faintly. "Alone is easier when you stop counting days." They brought the others to the clearing. Nathan shared coconuts and what little food he had. He spoke little but watched everything with the caution of someone who had learned that survival meant trust had to be earned, not given. As night fell, they built a fire. The survivors sat around it, faces glowing under orange light. The sea murmured nearby, carrying the sounds of the world they had lost. Sandra sat beside Keanu, staring at the flames. "We should build a signal," she said. "Something big enough to be seen from the air." Keanu nodded. "We can use parts from the wreckage. But first, we need to make sure everyone can move." "Some are still too weak," Nathan added quietly. "The tide brings in wreckage every morning. I've seen pieces of ships, plastic, even bottles with messages. If your plane broke apart nearby, more will come." His words lit a spark of strategy in Keanu's mind. "Then we wait for sunrise. We gather everything we can. We rebuild." Sandra smiled faintly. "Sounds like a plan." The group slept in shifts that night, guarded by the sound of waves. Keanu stayed awake longer, staring at the stars through the canopy. He thought about how fragile life was, how easily silence could follow laughter. He whispered to himself, "We were given another chance. I won't waste it." The morning came with golden light and the crash of waves. Debris from the plane washed ashore, seat cushions, metal panels, a few sealed containers. Keanu and Sandra led a group to collect supplies. Among the items was a water purifier kit and several emergency flares. It felt like a miracle scattered by the tide. But not everything that came from the sea was kind. As Sandra pulled a crate from the water, she noticed something strange carved into the wood. Symbols rough and uneven, as if someone had scratched them there long ago. She called Keanu over. He studied them, frowning. "These aren't from the plane. They look older." Nathan walked up behind them. When he saw the symbols, his face changed. "Don't touch that," he said sharply. "Why?" Sandra asked, startled. Nathan's voice dropped. "Those crates came before you. They come with the storms. Every few months, the ocean throws them back. Inside, there's nothing but papers. Old maps, names, and pictures of people who never existed." Sandra's eyes widened. "You mean someone's been sending these?" He looked toward the horizon. "Or something." The group opened one crate despite his warning. Inside were several waterproof envelopes containing faded documents. One had a list of names, and among them the name Keanu Reeves. Another, Sandra Bullock. The air around them grew still. Even the wind seemed to stop. Keanu stared at the paper, his heart thudding. "This can't be real." Nathan looked at him, his voice trembling. "I told you, the island doesn't let go easily. It brings people it already knows." Sandra felt her throat tighten. "What do you mean it knows?" Nathan pointed toward the dense forest behind the beach. "You'll see when the night comes. The island remembers every name it keeps." The survivors looked at each other, fear creeping into their exhausted eyes. What had seemed like salvation now felt like a trap written by fate itself. Keanu folded the paper and looked out at the horizon. "No island decides our story," he said firmly. "We'll build our signal. We'll leave." But as the wind shifted, the ocean began to hum with an eerie rhythm, waves rising and falling like a heartbeat. From the edge of the forest, the faint glow of blue light appeared, pulsing gently through the trees. Nathan's face turned pale. "It's starting again," Sandra whispered. "What's starting?" He looked toward the glowing forest. "The island is remembering." And as night fell once more, the survivors gathered closer to the fire, unaware that the island they had found was about to reveal the secret it had been keeping for years, one that would change everything they believed about their survival. And about themselves, the storm had ended, but the real mystery had just begun. The island remembers. The night deepened into a strange silence, a silence that felt alive. The fire crackled weakly as the survivors huddled closer together. The glow from the forest pulsed faintly like the heartbeat of something breathing beneath the earth. Sandra Bullock's eyes followed the light, hypnotized and uneasy. Keanu Reeves sat beside her, his face calm but his mind racing. He had survived fire, water, and fear. Yet the stillness of this island unsettled him in a way the storm never had. Nathan stood apart from the group, staring into the trees. The blue glow reflected in his eyes, and there was something in his expression, something between dread and longing. Sandra approached him quietly and asked, "What's out there?" He didn't answer immediately. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "It started 2 years after I came here. The light always appears where the sea meets the forest. It never stays long, but every time it comes, it leaves something behind. Voices, shadows, memories that aren't mine. Keanu joined them, his tone steady. Memories? Nathan nodded. You'll see. The island keeps pieces of those who were lost. It remembers faces, names, even their pain. Maybe that's why it brought you here. His words hung heavy in the air. Sandra tried to laugh softly, but it came out forced. We didn't wash up here for a ghost story. We're alive. We're going to be rescued. Nathan looked at her, his eyes hollow. I said the same thing. 3 years ago. Before anyone could respond, the light in the forest brightened. It shimmered through the branches, painting the leaves with an otherworldly glow. The air felt charged, heavy with static. Keanu turned to the others. Stay here. I'll check it out. Sandra immediately stepped forward. You're not going alone. He tried to argue, but she met his eyes with the same stubborn resolve that had saved lives on the plane. Finally, he nodded, and together they entered the forest. The path was narrow, their feet sinking into damp soil. The deeper they went, the stronger the glow became. It wasn't just light, it was movement. It pulsed in rhythm with their footsteps, like it could feel their presence. They reached a small clearing surrounded by trees twisted into impossible shapes. At its center stood a pool of perfectly still water, glowing faintly blue. Keanu stepped closer, his reflection shimmering on the surface. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. 2 reflections, not just theirs. Behind them, faint figures flickered like faded memories trapped between moments. She whispered, Keanu, do you see that? He turned slowly, but there was no one behind them. When he looked back at the pool, the figures had changed. Now it showed the plane, Flight 730, drifting through clouds, its engines failing again in perfect detail. They could hear faint voices, terrified cries, the captain's desperate commands. It was as if the water itself was replaying what had happened. Sandra stepped back, trembling. This is impossible. Keanu crouched, studying the reflection. It's not showing what's coming. It's showing what already happened. Then the image shifted. It now showed the beach, the very place where the survivors were sitting. But something was wrong. In the reflection, there were fewer people. Some were missing. And in the faint distance of that reflection, dark shapes moved near the tree line, watching silently. Sandra whispered, What if it's showing what will happen next? Before Keanu could answer, the light flickered violently. The sound of rushing wind filled the clearing, and the blue pool dimmed into black. In its final flicker, the reflection showed one last image. Nathan, standing alone, surrounded by fire. The light went out. They stumbled back through the forest, the wind howling through the branches. When they returned to the beach, the fire was nearly out. The survivors looked shaken. One of them, a young engineer named Mila, said she had heard whispers calling her name from the trees. Another claimed he saw figures walking along the shore, carrying lanterns made of blue light. Keanu exchanged a look with Sandra. Something was changing. The next morning, the survivors decided to move inland to find higher ground. They needed food, water, and a safer place to build a signal. Nathan reluctantly agreed to guide them, warning that the inner forest was full of strange echoes. The island isn't dead, he said. It listens. They packed what little they had, metal panels, bottles, bits of food, and began the climb. The forest grew thicker with every step, branches hanging low like arms trying to hold them back. The sound of the ocean faded behind them, replaced by the buzz of insects and the whisper of wind through leaves. Hours later, they reached a hill overlooking the island. From there, they saw something that made everyone stop. In the distance, beyond a valley, stood the rusted remains of another aircraft, half buried, overgrown with vines. Another crash, Sandra whispered. How long has it been here? Nathan's face went pale. I never came this far. I didn't know this was here. Keanu led the way down the slope, his instincts guiding him forward. The plane was smaller than theirs, but its shape was familiar, a rescue aircraft. Its markings were faded, yet one symbol was still visible, a red cross. Inside, the seats were empty, but signs of struggle were everywhere. Broken glass, torn fabric, old footprints, and near the cockpit, a faded journal lay on the ground. Sandra picked it up carefully, wiping away dust. The handwriting inside was shaky but clear. It read, "We came for the missing plane. Found only echoes. Something here doesn't let them leave." She turned the page and froze. Taped inside was a photograph of Nathan. He looked younger, standing beside two rescue officers. Keanu called him over, his tone sharp. "Nathan, what is this?" The man stared at the photo, confusion and fear fighting for control on his face. "That's me," he whispered. "But I don't remember this." "I don't remember being on that plane." Sandara's voice trembled. "How can that be possible?" He pressed his hand against his forehead as if trying to hold back the memories. "I thought I was on a ship. But maybe I wasn't." The survivors stood in stunned silence. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the wreckage. The blue light appeared again, faint but pulsing from the forest below. Keanu looked at it, his jaw tightening. "Whatever this island is, it's not just a place. It's a memory." Nathan fell to his knees, shaking. "It makes you forget who you were. It rewrites your story until you think you've always been here." Sandra touched his shoulder gently. "Then we have to leave before it takes us too." But as the words left her mouth, the ground trembled. A deep, distant rumble echoed through the forest, like the growl of something ancient waking from sleep. Birds exploded from the trees, their wings black against the dim sky. The blue light flared brighter, spreading in waves toward the crash site. Keanu shouted for everyone to run. They stumbled out of the wreckage, clutching what they could. Behind them, the abandoned aircraft began to glow from within, its metal vibrating like a struck bell. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the old plane exploded in a burst of blue fire, the sound shaking the island to its core. The survivors fell to the ground, shielding their faces from the shockwave. When the light faded, Keanu opened his eyes. The jungle was burning, but not with flame. It was glowing, pulsing with the same light as before. And through the smoke, figures walked once again, transparent silhouettes shaped like the lost passengers of both crashes, their faces calm, their steps silent. One of them stopped and looked directly at Keanu. It was the captain of Flight 730. The ghostly figure raised his hand, pointing toward the mountain at the center of the island. Sandra whispered, "He's showing us something." Keanu nodded, his voice steady despite the trembling earth. "Then that's where we go. Whatever this island wants us to see, we face it." And as the last of the daylight died behind them, the survivors began their journey toward the mountain, where the truth of the island and of their fate waited in the shadows. The ocean had taken them, the island had kept them, and now something older was ready to speak their names aloud. The island was remembering again. The mountain that spoke. The climb began at dawn, under a sky bruised with gray and gold. Mist rolled across the jungle, clinging to leaves and skin like breath from the island itself. The survivors moved in silence, carrying only what they could, a few tools, a few flares, and their last fragments of faith. Keanu Reeves walked at the front, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but his eyes remained sharp, searching. Behind him, Sandra Bullock supported a limping woman whose ankle had twisted during the explosion. No one complained anymore. Fear had become a quiet companion, walking beside them like a shadow that refused to rest. Nathan followed at a distance, muttering to himself. Since discovering his photograph in the wrecked rescue plane, something inside him had fractured. He spoke in pieces, recalling things half-remembered, names, voices, places that didn't belong to this island. Sandra noticed how he kept touching the scar on his arm, like he was trying to remember who gave it to him. She wanted to comfort him, but every word felt small in the face of something so strange. As they moved upward, the air grew colder, the forest thinner. Birds no longer sang here. Even the insects had fallen silent. The ground beneath their feet was black volcanic stone, smooth and ancient. And through the mist, they could see the faint blue glow pulsing near the mountain's peak, steady as a heartbeat. When they reached the halfway point, the group stopped to rest. The view below was hauntingly beautiful, the beach, the wreckage, and the endless ocean fading into silver light. Sandra sat beside Keanu, her voice low. "If we don't make it out, do you think anyone will ever know what happened here?" He looked at her, then at the horizon. "Someone will. Stories always find a way, even if they're whispered by the wind. Her lips curved into a tired smile. That sounds like something you'd say in a movie. He smiled faintly back. Maybe the movies learned it from us. Their brief laughter was swallowed by the wind. Then came a sound, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps echoing through stone. They turned to see Nathan standing near a dark crevice in the rock. "It's here," he said quietly. The island's heart. They followed him inside. The tunnel was narrow, lit only by shafts of pale blue light that seeped through cracks in the ceiling. The air was cool and smelled faintly of salt and metal. Deep within, they heard a low hum, like the vibration of machinery buried beneath the earth. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, and there, at its center, stood something none of them could explain. A massive circular structure, half buried in stone, pulsed with faint blue light. Its surface was smooth, metallic, and covered in markings similar to those carved on the mysterious crates. Around it, fragments of wreckage lay embedded in the ground. Pieces of aircraft, ships, even what looked like fragments of satellites. It was as if every disaster that had vanished near this island had been drawn here, absorbed into this strange machine. Sandra whispered, "What is this place?" Nathan stepped forward, his hand trembling. "It's what I dreamed about. Every night. I thought they were nightmares, but maybe they were memories." Keanu touched the edge of the structure. It was warm. The humming grew louder, and the light brightened in response to his touch. Suddenly, the cavern walls flickered with projections of images, faces, cities, storms, all overlapping. One by one, they saw flashes of every crash, every disappearance. They saw the first explorers who came centuries ago, ships swallowed by sudden storms. They saw aircrafts vanishing mid-air, drawn into the same blue light. And then, to their horror, they saw themselves, their own faces frozen in moments of fear aboard Flight 730. Sandra stepped back, her breath shaking. "It's showing us like we're already gone." The hum deepened into a voice, faint but clear, echoing through the stone. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like 1,000 memories speaking at once. "Every life that touches the sea becomes part of me," it said. "I am the witness of what the world forgets." Keanu's jaw tightened. "You're saying the island keeps us?" "Not to trap," the voice replied, "to remember. The world above moves fast. It forgets kindness, sacrifice, and fear. I hold what the sky leaves behind." The survivors stared in awe and terror. The island wasn't a curse. It was a memory keeper, collecting fragments of human moments lost to storms and tragedy. Sandra whispered, "Then why are we still alive?" "Because your story isn't finished," the voice answered. "One of you was meant to return." The light shifted, focusing on Keanu. His reflection shimmered across the metallic surface. He frowned. "Why me?" "You chose courage when the sky turned against you. You chose others over yourself. The world still needs to remember that." The words sent a chill through everyone. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "Then what happens to us?" The light dimmed. "Each of you carries something the world forgot. A kindness, a promise, a regret. To leave, you must give it back." Keanu turned to the others. "We all did something up there. Maybe this is how we make it matter." Nathan fell to his knees, clutching his head. "I remember now," he whispered. "I wasn't stranded by accident. I was the pilot of the rescue plane. I tried to find the others. I crashed because I ignored the warnings. I thought I could control the storm." Sandra touched his shoulder gently. "You don't have to stay trapped in it anymore." Nathan looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Maybe I do. Maybe this island kept me here until someone could finish what I started." Keanu took a deep breath. "Then let's finish it together." The survivors gathered around the structure, their reflections glowing in its surface. One by one, they spoke aloud the truths they carried. The regrets, the unspoken kindnesses, the people they loved and never thanked. As they spoke, the blue light absorbed their words, like waves swallowing pebbles. When it was Sandra's turn, she hesitated. "I was always afraid of not being enough, of being seen as strong when I felt small inside. But on that plane, I wasn't an actress. I was just human, and that's what saved me." The structure pulsed brighter. When Keanu spoke, his voice was calm. I spent my life pretending to be heroes. But courage isn't in acting. It's in choosing to care when everything tells you not to. If the world needs to remember something, let it remember that kindness doesn't end in storms. The cavern filled with light so bright that everyone had to close their eyes. The hum grew louder, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence. When they opened their eyes, the structure was gone. In its place was a small pool of still, clear water. Their reflections were the only thing left. Nathan looked around, confused. Did it end? Keanu shook his head slowly. No. It gave us back our chance. Outside, they heard the distant roar of engines. They ran to the mouth of the cavern, hearts pounding. Across the horizon, a rescue helicopter was circling the island, its lights cutting through the mist. For the first time, the blue glow was gone, the island no longer hiding from the world. The survivors waved frantically, shouting, lighting flares. The helicopter turned toward them, descending closer. Sandra looked back at the mountain. "What about the island?" she whispered. Keanu followed her gaze. "It'll remember us." As the helicopter approached, a gust of wind swept across the trees. The mist lifted, revealing not just the wreckage of their plane, but the faint outlines of countless others, shadows of history resting in peace. The survivors boarded the rescue craft, holding each other in disbelief. Nathan stayed behind, standing at the edge of the mountain, watching them leave. Keanu's eyes met his through the open door. Nathan smiled faintly. "Some stories are meant to stay." The helicopter lifted off, carrying the living away from the island that remembered. As they rose above the clouds, Sandra looked down one last time. The mountain shimmered faintly, and for a moment, she thought she saw the island's light form one final word across the shore. "Thank you." The storm was gone, the sea calm again, but something inside them had changed forever. They had entered the sky as strangers, fallen as survivors, and left as part of a memory the world would never truly understand. And yet, deep below, the island waited, quiet, ancient, and kind, ready to remember the next soul the storm might bring. The world that forgot the helicopter soared above the endless ocean, carrying the survivors away from the island that had become both their prison and their salvation. The wind whipped through the open doors, salt mist blending with the scent of fuel. Below them, the island shimmered one last time, faint traces of blue light pulsing through its trees, as if it were saying goodbye. Sandra Bullock pressed her hand against the window, unable to look away. Keanu Reeves sat beside her, silent, his mind heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. For hours, no one spoke. Exhaustion hung over them like fog. Every face carried the same disbelief that they had survived something that defied all sense. When the coastline finally appeared, dotted with the lights of civilization, tears filled their eyes. The rescue team cheered over the radio, saying the impossible had happened. They landed at a naval base where doctors and officers rushed forward. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and medics covered them in blankets. But the noise felt distant, unreal. Sandra and Keanu looked around for Nathan, forgetting for a moment that he had stayed behind. A medic asked where their third rescuer was. Sandra hesitated before whispering, "He chose to stay." The words echoed in her chest like a quiet ache. They were taken to a recovery center, isolated for observation. Doctors ran tests. Psychologists asked endless questions. Everyone wanted answers about the crash, about the island, about how they survived without communication or supplies. Yet every time they tried to explain, their words sounded like fiction. When Keanu mentioned the blue light, the officials exchanged uneasy glances. When Sandra described the memory pool and the voice in the mountain, they wrote notes quietly, never meeting her eyes. One night, after days of interviews, Keanu and Sandra stood together outside the facility. The ocean stretched in the distance, calm and silent. Keanu broke the quiet first. "They don't believe a word of it." Sandra nodded. "They never will. Maybe they're not meant to." He looked at her. "Then why were we meant to come back?" Before she could answer, a nurse approached them carrying a sealed envelope. She said it had arrived with no return address, only marked with a single word: memory. Keanu opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. It showed the survivors standing together on the beach at dawn just before rescue came. Nathan was there too, smiling in the background. Sandra's breath caught. That's impossible. He wasn't with us when the helicopter came. On the back of the photo was a line written in faded ink. The island remembers, but the world forgets. They looked at each other, silent, knowing what it meant. The island hadn't just let them go. It had given them a message. In the days that followed, each survivor received something strange. One found an old compass engraved with her initials. Another discovered a seashell in his pocket that whispered faint waves when held to the ear. Sandra received a small vial filled with clear water. When she tilted it, faint blue light shimmered within. Keanu's gift came last, a folded piece of paper, placed beside his bed while he slept. It read, "You gave courage to the sky. Now give kindness to the ground." The next morning, he called Sandra and said quietly, "We can't let the story die here. Maybe they won't believe what happened, but they can believe what it meant." And so, they began again. Keanu founded a global initiative to train young pilots in crisis response, emphasizing compassion as the first skill, not the last. He called it Flight 730 Foundation. Sandra, moved by what they had seen, started an island research program dedicated to lost history, projects that preserved memories of forgotten heroes and unnamed acts of kindness. Months passed. The world celebrated their survival as a miracle, but only they knew the truth, that survival was not the miracle, remembering was. One evening, after a long day of charity work, Sandra visited Keanu's house near the ocean. The sunset painted the water gold. She carried a box of letters from survivors, thank you notes, photos, stories they had shared. They sat on the porch reading them quietly. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked. Keanu nodded. "Every time I see the sea." She smiled sadly. "I keep wondering if the island still remembers us." He looked at the horizon, where the last of the light met the waves. "It does. You can feel it when the wind changes. It remembers the people who chose kindness when they could have chosen fear." As night fell, a soft blue glow appeared along the shoreline, just a flicker, barely visible. Sandra noticed it first and whispered, "Look." Keanu stood, watching the light dance across the waves. It pulsed gently, the same rhythm they had seen on the island. A single phrase seemed to echo in the air, unspoken yet clear. "Thank you for remembering." The glow faded slowly, sinking back into the sea, leaving behind only starlight. Sandra turned to Keanu, her eyes bright with tears. "Maybe the island wasn't a place. Maybe it was a mirror. It showed us who we really are." He nodded. "And who we can still be." They sat in silence after that, listening to the quiet crash of waves. The world behind them buzzed with noise, with headlines and schedules and the endless pace of forgetting. But here at the edge of the sea, time felt slow again, kind again. Years later, when the anniversary of the crash came, people gathered around the world to honor the lives lost and the ones who survived. On the news, anchors spoke of courage and unity, of two actors who became symbols of resilience and grace. But away from cameras, Keanu and Sandra visited a small coastal town where they had built a memorial garden. It was simple, just trees, a bench, and a plaque that read, "For the ones who gave and the ones who remembered." As they stood there, a breeze passed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of salt and rain. Sandra closed her eyes. For a moment, she could hear the hum again, the heartbeat of the island, faint but alive. She opened her eyes and whispered, "We never really left, did we?" Keanu smiled softly. "No. Part of us stayed to keep remembering." The camera of the world had moved on, but the story lived quietly in those who believed. It lived in every act of courage that began with kindness, every stranger who stopped to help another, every memory that refused to fade. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the island slept beneath the clouds, glowing faintly in the depths of the ocean, waiting for the next storm, the next lost soul, the next story worth remembering. For the island that remembered was never about loss. It was about love, the kind that survives everything, even the fall from the sky.